Hiro Matsuda shoved the spoon into his mouth before anyone could stop him. The white granules on the mess table had glistened under the harsh light of the canteen, soft, powdery, almost luxurious. To a homesick boy from the outskirts of Nagasaki, barely 19 and barely breathing without trembling, it looked like a miracle. Sugar. Real sugar. Not dried rice powder or bean flour. Not chalky ration crumbs or boiled starch. This was glinting white heaven, piled beside the dull gray porridge in an ordinary aluminum tray. And Hiro, like every other soldier trained to obey hunger before caution, scooped a generous spoonful and shoveled it past his lips. The sound he made next froze everyone. His face scrunched as if he had been punched. His eyes watered instantly. Then his shoulders began to shake. At first, Shunji thought the boy was choking. He started forward, alarmed. But then he saw Hiro's jaw loosen, his arms wrap around his own belly, and the unmistakable sound escape. Laughter. Gasping, high-pitched, ridiculous laughter. Hiro couldn't stop. Even as his tongue flailed against the taste, even as he spat flecks onto his tray, he howled with amusement. A few other prisoners leaned in, puzzled. Some whispered, others chuckled in confusion. Shunji stood over him now, frowning, but something in the boy's hysterics made his lips twitch. "What is it?" asked Private Takuda from across the bench. Shunji dipped the tip of his finger into the white mound and brought it to his tongue. The shock was immediate. Salt. Not sugar. Bitter. Granular. Deceptive. Shunji's eyes widened, and for a split second, he was back in his mother's kitchen in Osaka, dipping stolen radishes in saltwater brine. That sharp, mineral taste. The burning disappointment. And then he began to grin. "They thought they were giving us punishment," he said quietly. His voice had a strange rhythm to it, slow and deliberate. "But they've never seen joy through confusion." The line caught Takuda off guard. "What?" Shunji said nothing more, just smiled, turned to Hiro and clapped a hand on his shoulder. The boy was still giggling, now quieter, hiccuping with what looked almost like relief. The canteen was cold and metallic, the long room echoing with every clang of trays and scrape of boots. American guards stood along the perimeter, one near the kitchen entrance, another by the southern window. But none had intervened yet. They had no idea what had just occurred. To them, it was just a group of hungry foreigners acting odd over food. But something had shifted in that moment. The salt, meant to flavor the porridge, had become a joke no one understood except those seated at that table. A private rebellion, born out of a misunderstanding. And that, Shunji realized, was power. As the meal continued, more men began testing it, dabbing their fingers, faking surprise, then breaking into exaggerated expressions of betrayal and glee. By the end of the hour, 2 men had pretended to faint. One fell off his bench on purpose, and another drew a little smiley face with the salt on the edge of his tray. Private Haruto, a former schoolteacher, whispered, "We're going to get in trouble." "Only if they understand the joke," Shunji replied without looking up. At the far end of the room, the metal door groaned open, and a tall figure stepped in. One of the guards. Shunji didn't recognize him. Broad-shouldered with a dark mustache and narrowed eyes, chewing something with a slow, grinding jaw. His name, they would learn later, was Sergeant Alan Dorr. He stepped in, surveying the room with a gaze too calm to be comforting. A second man followed, younger, thinner, clutching a clipboard. They paused. The laughter had returned. Softer now, but contagious. Shunji caught Dorr's eye for a brief second and saw the flicker of unease. "They're mocking us," the sergeant muttered to the clipboard man, who nodded as if unsure. But there was no rule against smiling. Not yet. That night, back in the barracks, Hiro sat on his bunk, still tasting the sting of the salt. His eyes were wide, but not with fear, with curiosity. "Why was it so funny?" he asked. Shunji leaned back against the wooden frame and exhaled. Because in a place meant to break us, he said slowly, they forgot the one thing they can't understand. What's that? Joy that doesn't come from victory, just confusion. He smirked, then added, sometimes that's stronger. Outside, the wind rustled pine needles against the thin metal siding. Somewhere, a dog barked and was quickly silenced. In the darkness of the Colorado woods, surrounded by fences, rifles, and eyes that watched even in sleep, a small ember had been lit in the cold, strange and bright and almost stupid in its simplicity. But it was theirs. And though none of them knew what tomorrow would bring, one thing was certain. Something had started with that spoonful. Something bigger than taste. Something harder to extinguish than a simple laugh. They thought they were punishing us, Shunji said, catching on, but they've never seen joy through confusion. The laughter broke out just as the metal trays clattered onto the long pine tables. It was sharp, sudden, and echoing. Sergeant Alan Dorr's head snapped up from his clipboard, cigar smoke curling around his face like a slow-moving threat. He squinted toward the noise, his jaw clenched beneath thick jowls. Across the mess hall, half a dozen Japanese prisoners of war were hunched over their bowls, shoulders shaking not from cold, but from suppressed giggles. "Corporal Winslow," Dorr grunted, voice heavy with suspicion. "You hear that?" Corporal Winslow straightened, his expression more confused than concerned. "Laughter, sir." "Sounds like they're joking." "They're mocking us," Dorr said flatly, eyes narrowing. "Find out what's so funny." As Winslow crossed the floor, boots tapping against the concrete in stiff rhythm, the laughter tried to stifle itself. But, like a poorly capped canteen, it kept spilling. Private Hiro Matsuda was red in the face, barely holding it together, his spoon gripped tightly in one hand like a child trying to maintain discipline in church. Across from him, Private Shunji Hattori simply stared into his porridge, a sly smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Winslow stopped beside them. "What's the joke?" No one answered. He looked down at the food, noticed the untouched pile of salt to the side. Hiro's lips still twitched as he stared at it, eyes shimmering with restrained glee. "Speak," Winslow barked, "or I'll have you scrubbing latrines till sunrise." "It's just," Hiro said, his accent thick, his voice quiet. "We thought it was sugar." The silence that followed was even louder than the laughter had been. Winslow looked back at Dorr, who watched from the other end of the room like a dog waiting for a signal to bite. "Salt?" Winslow asked, frowning. "That's what's funny." "It's all we have," Shunji added coolly, lifting his spoon with exaggerated elegance. "We find sweetness where we can." The joke had started innocently, an accident, really. On their first morning, Hiro had mistaken the white granules for sugar and shoveled a spoonful onto his food. The look on his face had been enough to break a dam. But now it was becoming something else. Ritual. Resistance. In the barracks that night, the energy was different. Shunji sat near the wall, listening as the others mimicked what had happened earlier at dinner. "I swear, my tongue flipped backward," one young soldier laughed, pantomiming his own exaggerated gag. "It's like seasoning with betrayal," another added, drawing chuckles from the group. Shunji didn't join the laughter this time. He just watched. "They don't like when we smile," he said softly to Hiro, who had calmed but still grinned under his blanket. "They expect silence, submission. But when we laugh, it confuses them. It makes them angry," Hiro said. "Good," Shunji whispered. "Confusion is the seed of freedom." The next morning, the laughter returned. This time, more intentional. Salt was passed around like treasure, sprinkled over porridge with ceremonial flair. Soldiers dared one another to heap it onto their trays. Each mouthful brought a new round of giggles. Shunji noticed even the older prisoners were loosening, letting their grim routines slip just enough to make room for something else, something warm. The guards weren't blind. By the third morning, the mess hall crackled with tension. Trays were set down with more force. Orders were barked louder. Eyes lingered longer. And Sergeant Dorr, whose patience wore thin like cheap leather, paced behind the benches like a wolf that hadn't eaten in days. Then Private Okabe made his mistake. It was subtle, barely more than a twitch. He stood from the bench with stiff shoulders and waddled toward the waste bin in exaggerated steps, arms swinging low, mimicking the wide-legged swagger of Sergeant Dorr. It lasted all of 5 seconds, but it was enough. The laughter that followed was involuntary, explosive. Dorr saw it all. He didn't shout, he didn't bark, he just walked forward. The laughter died instantly. Okabe froze mid-step, his face draining of color. "Sir, Dorr's fist met his stomach with a wet thud. The air punched out of Okabe's lungs before he could finish his sentence. He crumpled forward, gasping, as Dorr grabbed him by the collar and dragged him out of the hall without a word. The metal doors slammed shut behind them like a jail cell locking for the final time. No one spoke. No one moved. An hour passed. Then 2. By late afternoon, Okabe returned. He didn't speak either. He just limped into the barracks, his eyes dull and one side of his face swollen. He lowered himself slowly onto his cot, wincing as he did. No one dared ask what happened. They already knew. That night, as the barracks dimmed into moonlight and the guards made their final rounds, Shunji sat at the edge of his bunk. He stared at the wooden slats above him, fingers tracing a shallow groove someone had carved years before. Hiro sat nearby, watching Okabe sleep. "It was only a joke," Hiro whispered, voice trembling. Shunji turned his head slowly. "No," he said. "It's not the salt they hate," he whispered, his voice low, deliberate and cold. "It's the sound of us smiling." A sharp thud echoed across the canteen as a metal tray hit the floor. Private Hideo, standing just a few steps from the long wooden bench, clutched his stomach and dropped to his knees. His face twisted, not in pain, but in dread. Foam bubbled at the corners of his mouth as he gasped once, then fell sideways into the dust. Shunji's spoon froze halfway to his lips. Around him, the quiet chatter stopped instantly. Every prisoner went still, every breath caught in their throat. Across the room, Hiro's eyes went wide with terror, hands trembling against his bowl. Guards rushed in. Sergeant Dorr barked orders while 2 privates lifted Hideo's body and dragged him out without explanation, his legs trailing lifelessly behind. It wasn't just salt anymore. "What was in that?" Hiro whispered, voice barely audible. Shunji didn't answer. He was staring at the small ceramic shaker the guards had brought in that morning. It wasn't the usual white salt they'd grown used to mocking. The powder inside had a faint blue tint, subtle but unmistakable in the light slanting through the windows. Dorr had called it new seasoning, smirking as if he were in on a cruel joke no one else understood. By evening, a storm had settled over Camp Alderidge, not a natural one, but one of silence. Gone were the soft chuckles, the absurd tray formations, the playful phrases of fake recipes. Gone was the mischief they had used to turn oppression into resilience. Even the air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. Inside Barracks 12, the mood was grim. "He's alive," someone finally said about Hideo. "Sick. Not dead." "That powder," another added, "burned his mouth." He couldn't even cry properly. Shunji sat with his hands clasped tightly between his knees. "They're not trying to poison us," he said. "They're trying to erase the part of us that laughs." Hiro looked up, confusion creasing his brow. "Why?" "Because laughter makes them unsure. It makes us unpredictable. They don't want prisoners with spirit. They want ghosts in uniforms." The next day, Shunji led the others in silence, but his mind was burning. He adjusted the timing of every signal they had etched above the mess hall, shifting one carved triangle to the left, adding a second notch beside a window beam. Distraction was no longer safe, but urgency made it necessary. Their fake recipes, ridiculous as they were, had bought them time. Now, time was running short. At breakfast, Shunji sat beside Hiro and nodded slightly toward the new powder shaker. "I'll do it," Hiro whispered. "They won't watch me." "No." Shunji grabbed his wrist gently. "We do nothing for now. Let them think we've stopped that day." Corporal Winslow entered during lunch, eyes sweeping the room. "You boys aren't so funny anymore," he muttered. "Guess the joke's over." Shunji smiled faintly, his eyes not meeting Winslow's. Some jokes take longer to land. That night, Shunji unwrapped a scrap of torn paper he'd hidden inside the barracks wall. On it were 4 lines of mock recipe text, smudged and worn. He didn't need to read them. He'd written them in perfect English weeks ago. What began as nonsense had evolved into code, and now it would serve a new purpose. He handed the scrap to Hiro and nodded. "Hide it behind the beam by the water spigot. But carefully. If they find it, they'll start searching every nail and floorboard." As Hiro slipped into the night, Shunji looked out across the yard. A spotlight swept past the fence, gliding over rows of worn boots and barbed wire. Somewhere in the dark, a plan waited, unfinished, but alive. The next morning, a different kind of tension filled the air. The guards stood taller. The prisoners hunched lower. Hideo had returned, barely able to stand, lips still cracked. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The message had been delivered. Shunji sat with his porridge unmoving. The new powder sat untouched at the end of the table. "They've changed the game," he murmured, voice so low only Hiro could hear, "and now it's poisoned with silence." The moment the first spoonful touched his tongue, Private Suda's face twisted violently. His jaw clenched, eyes shut tight, and he dropped the utensil with a metallic clatter. A few men turned their heads, expecting another prank, another misread joke, but there was no laughter. Suda hunched over, retching into his tin bowl. His fingers trembled. Shunji Hattori stood 2 paces away, his brows drawn together as he silently stepped forward, steadying Suda's shoulder. Across the mess hall, Sergeant Alan Dorr watched from the doorway, arms crossed, cigar twitching between his teeth. His posture was stiff, his glare unwavering. No words came from him, just the cold satisfaction of a man who believed order had been restored. But Shunji saw it for what it was. Not punishment, but a message. A warning dressed in powder. The salt had been replaced. The joy stolen. And in its place, something dry, bitter, chemical, designed not to harm, but to suppress. The kind of silence that eats at memory. That night, under the low drone of the generator and the occasional bark of distant dogs, Shunji lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling's faint wooden beams. His fingers traced the underside of the cot where he'd hidden a sliver of glass for emergencies. But tonight wasn't for violence. It was for strategy. He rose quietly and slipped into the cold air outside. Every creak of the barrack floor sounded like thunder, but no one stirred. He reached the infirmary by foot, hunched low beneath windows. Inside, the silhouette of a nurse passed once, then disappeared into a back room. Shunji gave it 3 long breaths. Then he knocked. When the door cracked open, he cupped his jaw and muttered, "Tooth. Pain." The guard on duty, a lanky, indifferent private, groaned but waved him in. Inside the dimly lit infirmary, the scent of rubbing alcohol and cold metal filled his nose. Bottles lined the shelves, some labeled, some not. The nurse didn't ask questions, just gestured toward a stool. But as he turned to fetch gauze, Shunji made his move. Quick fingers, 1 bottle, molasses. Used to treat mild dehydration, sometimes mixed in rations to mask bitterness. He slid it beneath his sleeve, nodded at the nurse, and pressed a hand to his cheek as he left. Back in the barracks, he moved like a ghost. Hiro stirred, eyes blinking wide. "Shunji," he whispered. "Shh." Not yet. By morning, the porridge sat steaming, lifeless as always. But Shunji's spoon moved with purpose. From the vial, he added a thin trail of syrup into the salt. Not enough to overwhelm, just enough to mask, enough to confuse. One by one, the others took their trays. No orders were given, no glances exchanged, just small, deliberate motions. Shunji watched closely. Private Tanaka paused, mouth still. His lips curled, not in disgust, not in mockery, but in quiet disbelief. He looked up, caught Shunji's eye across the room, and gave the smallest of nods. Then another, then another. No one laughed, but something was rising. Across the mess hall, backs straightened, faces lifted. Even Hiro, normally hunched and silent, now chewed with a soft determination, as though that mouthful of sweetness was proof that resistance didn't need fists, it only needed clarity. That's when the door slammed open. Sergeant Dorr's boots hit the floor like gunshots. He didn't shout at first. He scanned the room, jaw chewing the cigar like bone. His eyes landed on the formation of trays, symmetrical again. Too symmetrical. Someone had rearranged them like an altar. "Who did this?" he barked. No answer. He stormed down the aisle, stopping beside one of the trays. His hand shot out, flipping it violently. Porridge splattered across the floor. The prisoner didn't flinch. "You think this is funny?" he roared. "Is this a game to you?" Still, silence. Not defiance, something colder. He turned, his voice now shaking with rage. "Answer me!" Shunji rose from his bench. His voice was calm, his posture still. "No, sir," he said, meeting Dorr's eyes. "But you've already lost the board." "Sugar." The word landed like a dropped spoon in a cathedral. Roll call had been perfectly silent until that single syllable rang out. Every prisoner in Camp Alderage stood rigid in their fatigues, heads forward, eyes down. But not Hiro. He stood in the front row, trembling only slightly, with a carved wooden spoon held up like a flag. His voice was soft, almost childlike in tone, but it sliced through the cold mountain air with unsettling precision. "Sugar," he repeated, this time firmer. The guards exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh, shout, or reach for their batons. Lieutenant Francis Dow's reaction was immediate. The commander's boots crunched forward through the gravel, his jaw tight, his leather gloves creaking with each clench. "Who gave him permission to speak?" he barked, eyes darting across the line. No one answered. Even Hiro remained quiet now, his spoon still aloft, unwavering. Dow's voice dropped, but the menace in it only deepened. "Let me make this clear. From this moment forward, no powdered seasoning, no molasses, and certainly no smiles during inspection. You think this is a game? Let's see how funny it is." In solitary Shunji Hattori's stomach turned. He watched Dow circle the formation like a hunting dog, eyes flicking from face to face. For a moment, Shunji feared Hiro would be dragged away like Okabe had been days before. But just then, a jeep rolled into the courtyard, tires cracking over the gravel, engine coughing before dying off. A tall man stepped out. Unlike Dow, this one didn't wear the same stiffness in his posture. His uniform was cleaner, creased like fresh paper. He had wire-rimmed glasses and carried a satchel slung across his chest, not a weapon. His boots didn't stomp. They stepped, measured, curious. "Lieutenant Marcus Bellman," he introduced himself briskly, handing a folder to the nearest guard. "Psych Ops Division. Colonel Harwick sent me down from the Denver office. There've been reports." Dow's irritation flared like gunpowder. "We're handling it," he snapped. "What you see here is discipline, not chaos." Bellman tilted his head, unconvinced. "Then let me observe. A few meals, a few rounds of inspection. No interference. I'll file my own report." Without waiting for agreement, Bellman turned and walked directly into the line of prisoners. Shunji's eyes narrowed. This man didn't move like the others. He didn't look through them. He looked at them. As Bellman passed Hiro, he paused. Then he looked down at the spoon, still held like a sword. "Sugar, huh?" he said under his breath. half a smile forming. Hiro blinked, unsure how to respond. That afternoon, Bellman did as promised. He sat quietly during lunch, eating the same thin porridge. When one of the guards placed a jar of seasoning at the end of the table, Bellman leaned forward. "Mind if I try that?" he asked, already unscrewing the lid. He sniffed it first, his nose twitched, and then he sprinkled a bit onto his own tray. His first bite ended in a grimace. "Ammonium salt?" he asked aloud, turning toward the guard. "That's what you're feeding them?" "It's regulation substitute," the guard mumbled. "Technically edible." Bellman turned toward the prisoner seated nearby, watching him in silence. "Clever," he muttered. "Cruel, but clever." Then he stood, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, and made his way straight to Dao's office. Shunji couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the lieutenant's face flushing red through the narrow office window. Bellman's hands moved quickly as he spoke, pointing at documents, gesturing toward the mess hall, then toward the barracks. 10 minutes later, the camp intercom buzzed for the first time in days. "Effective immediately," the speaker crackled. "All substitute seasoning is suspended. Approved rations will include standard salt and sugar per nutrition guidelines." There was no cheering, no clapping, but in the barracks that night, the men sat together longer than usual. They shared spoonfuls of the sugar ration, mixed into bowls of stale rice. It was nothing, and yet it was everything. Shunji sat beside Hiro and said quietly, "That spoon you raised. I thought they'd lock you up." Hiro nodded. "I thought so too. But I kept thinking, if I laugh, they hit me. If I speak, they silence me. So I tried something small." Shunji glanced toward the window where Bellman stood, smoking alone in the dusk. Small is how it starts. The following day, Bellman returned to the mess. He took his seat among the men, this time without clipboard or file. He simply ate. And when the molasses jar was brought out, he personally unscrewed the lid and passed it down the line. No one laughed, but Shunji noticed the guards staring, visibly uncomfortable as prisoner after prisoner nodded and ate in peace. The ritual had shifted, no longer mockery, but memory. Resistance etched in routine. Bellman leaned over to the nearest prisoner and said with a chuckle, "They've earned it, 1 grain at a time." The tray clattered loudly against the stone floor. Molasses had been banned, salt replaced. Inspections tightened. Yet this morning, the guards found laughter again, quiet but unmistakable, bubbling beneath the surface like a whisper shared between old friends. It wasn't loud or rebellious. It was steady, unshakable. A line of prisoners sat cross-legged outside the mess hall, their faces calm, their shoulders aligned with a subtle defiance that unnerved the guards more than any shouting ever could. Lieutenant Marcus Bellman stood watching them through the window, arms folded. The early sunlight caught the edge of his polished insignia, but his attention was fixed on one face in particular, Shunji Hattori's. The young POW was speaking softly to Hiro, his hands moving to mimic some exaggerated scene, and the smaller man burst into silent laughter, clutching his sides like a child hiding a secret. Other prisoners nearby stifled grins. Even Bellman, though he did not smile, let out a small breath that wasn't quite a sigh. Inside the guardhouse, Sergeant Dorr cursed as he lit his morning cigar. "What the hell is going on out there?" he growled. "Didn't we take away the molasses?" "The sugar, the jokes." "You took the seasoning," Bellman said, stepping in, "not their ability to find light." His voice was even, but his gaze was sharper now, dissecting the failures of cruelty like a surgeon who refused to cut further. Dorr scoffed and stormed out. By noon, it was clear. Something had changed. Shunji's rebellion had evolved. No longer a prank, no longer coded jokes or mock recipes. It had become culture, routine, language. One guard caught a prisoner using a spoon as a drumstick, lightly tapping it against his canteen in rhythm with others. No songs, no chants, just a beat, a heartbeat. Later that week, Bellman did what no officer had done before. He stepped into the mess hall during lunch, took a seat beside the prisoners, and waved off the other soldiers. "I won't be needing guards," he said quietly. "Just a spoon." Shunji, seated across from him, didn't speak at first. He simply passed Bellman a wooden spoon, one the prisoners had carved, burned along the handle with tiny letters that spelled out sweet. Bellman turned it over in his fingers. "You carved this?" "We all did," Shunji replied, voice steady. "Each letter was a day we remembered how." Bellman nodded slowly. "Do you know why I was sent here?" Shunji met his eyes. "To silence us, I imagine." Bellman gave a tired smile. "To understand you." He took a bite of the porridge, grimaced, then looked up. "No seasoning." Shunji said nothing, but Hiro, seated to his left, leaned in and offered a small metal packet, one of the last hidden sachets of stolen sugar. Bellman looked at it, looked at the boy, and for a moment said nothing. "I shouldn't," Bellman said, "but I will." The next day, an official change was posted on the board. Standard rations are to include sugar. 1 packet per prisoner per day. Signed, Lieutenant Marcus Bellman. Guards grumbled. Dorr protested. But the order stood. From that point on, Camp Aldridge became different. Not soft, not relaxed, but fair. Chessboards appeared in the rec room. A typewriter was placed in the corner. English lessons were no longer banned. Shunji led quiet discussions under the eaves of the barracks, trading stories with other men, encouraging the timid and reminding them, "You don't need a weapon to resist, just a reason to stand taller." And Hiro, once shaking at the sound of boots, began teaching English in short sessions, pointing to the sun and saying, "Sweet," then to the sugar packet, then to a cracked wooden spoon. His lessons weren't formal, but they were remembered. One afternoon, Bellman requested a private meeting with Shunji. The camp would be closing in weeks, he said. Prisoners were being relocated, and repatriation was coming soon. But before that, Bellman added, setting a box on the table between them, "I wanted you to have something." Inside were sugar packets. Dozens. "You're handing out contraband now?" Shunji asked with a half-smile. Bellman shook his head. "Official ration." With a small bonus, Shunji lifted 1 packet and turned it over. Tucked behind the seal was a folded scrap of paper, smaller than a cigarette stub. Bellman stood to leave. "I know what you were really doing," he said, resting a hand briefly on Shunji's shoulder. "And I let it happen." Shunji's fingers tightened around the packet. He looked up, the dim light catching the edge of his dark eyes. "Sometimes you survive," he said, "by remembering how to laugh." And as the trucks rumbled quietly into the fog that August morning, carrying each man out of Camp Aldridge, no one spoke, but each carried in his pocket a ration of sweetness, and in Shunji's, a final note that read, "Keep laughing." They never knew how to. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of culture shock, humor, and shared humanity in unexpected moments. Its purpose is to entertain while reminding viewers that laughter can bridge even the deepest divides and turn misunderstanding into connection.